everyone. Dear Dr. Kira Winke, dear Katja Cic, dear Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, dear Catherine, dear Dr. Parag Khanna, welcome to the Amerikahaus, and of course also welcome to all of you who joined us here tonight in our auditorium for our first session of this year's MSc at Amerikahaus Emerging Leaders Hub. It's great that you are here. I also like to welcome everyone on the live stream. My name is Markus Faltermeier. I'm the head of programs on trade and security at the Amerikahaus, and it is my pleasure to open our 2026 MSc at Amerikahaus Leader Series of events with you tonight together with the Bertelsmann Foundation. The Bertelsmann Foundation is one of our most valuable partners when it comes to tackling the immediate challenges that we face on the social as well as on the political plane. I'd specifically like to thank Dr. Daniela Schwarzer and Catherine for making this event possible. This is actually the fourth time that we are hosting the Emerging Leaders Hub at the Amerikahaus and that we are opening it together with the Bertelsmann Foundation. And it was always a great event and a great pleasure to work with you. As you probably all know, the Munich Security Conference is to many a very hermetic space where the decisions concerning our future, yours and mine, are being decided behind closed doors. Our sessions at MSc at Amerikahaus aim to bridge the gap between this exclusive space at the Bayerische Hof and the general public. We want to open the conversation for a more general, a broader audience with a particular focus on emerging leaders, the next generation of decision makers, the ones that I will entrust to take care of my security when I'm no longer able to do so myself. I'm not sure if I am right now, actually. So I therefore cannot thank Bertelsmann enough for supporting this approach towards a more open MSc with us. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Daniela Schwarzer on stage. She will give her welcome remarks. And again, thank you all for being here. And I hope you have a great evening with us today. And I hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Markus, thank you so much for your warm welcome and in particular for our partnership. We feel like we are an old partner to you, although it's only been 4 years that we've been working together on this event. And just like you said, it's also our interest not only to be part of the Munich Security Conference in the inner circle, but also to open up space for discussions. The Bertelsmann Foundation likes to reach out to various publics, and we have a particular focus on the young generation, because we as a foundation are very interested that policies are future-proof and that when we think about what the best solutions are for the problems we are facing today, we bear in mind what the challenges tomorrow will be, and part of them you and I won't live, but you will. So this is why this format is of particular importance to us, and this topic tonight is of utmost importance as well. You see it up there, human thriving in an age of spiking conflict. Spiking conflict doesn't sound good, but we all know that's the world we're living in. It is a world of many challenges, of conflicts, weaponized wars, even on our continent now, also for 4 years, but also all kinds of other conflicts about resources, about flows, migration and other flows that countries or groups want to control and want to use to their benefit. So the question of resilience is one that we as a foundation really see as central to our work, because we know that the existing systems are under attack. And when we speak about resilience, we have to speak about security questions, human security questions in the broadest possible sense. But we also have to speak about resilience of our economic systems and our democracies. So this is a subject which you will hear discussions about tonight and which you will join in discussing, which are very broad. Surely there will be discussions about the effects of climate change, of migration, and many other issues that come to the table. And I think it is absolutely right to dare to talk about these complexities and to do this in a sense of forward-looking policy formulation. So to understand how to grasp the challenges that are ahead of us, the question what we can do with new data, AI, with forecasting methods, the role of actors in all of this, like we are, civil society actors, NGOs, but also all others that have their role to play. So the big question for us here tonight, but also for us as a foundation, is always how can we keep the eyes on the medium and long-term issues while we are so caught up in crises and conflicts that occupy our minds every day when we open our phones to look at the latest news. Now, we will start this evening with a very specific input. And I'm very, very glad to, in a moment, welcome Dr. Parag Khanna to the stage, who is also a member of, or a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. So he also has invested time and effort into one of the important global networks for young leaders with the WEF. Now, Parag is the author of a monography which is called Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. And he's also the founder and CEO of AlphaGeo, which is a leading AI-powered geospatial analytics platform. And I'm really happy that we have him to provide us with the initial input and some provocative thoughts, how we should think about the question of resilience and human thriving in the age of spiking conflict. Parag, the floor is yours. Please join me.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Daniela, for that very important context setting. And Catherine, thank you for putting this so centrally on the agenda. It's deeply, deeply appreciated and more necessary than ever. And Marcos of the Amerikahaus, thank you for hosting us. I didn't get a chance to tell you earlier, but a lifetime ago, more than 3 decades, literally, the Amerikahaus Hamburg was like my home away from home. So I get very nostalgic being here this evening. It's much smaller, the one in Hamburg, actually, very, very cozy though. And so I'm delighted to be here this evening. And at that time, when I was young, no, I'm not anymore. I do remember though that when I started studying geopolitics and security issues, the human security agenda actually became a thing, you might say, in the mid-1990s. And it was European and Canadian scholars in particular who brought it to the center of the agenda. And of course, now we're all talking about Mark Carney's speech at Davos and middle power axes and so forth. But what he and actually what the scholars at the time in the transatlantic domain who were focused on human security was really elevating the things that we're going to talk about this evening and the things that Daniela already highlighted in her remarks. Everything at the nexus of conflict, migration, climate, and so on. So with that in mind, let me jump in, just share a few slides before we have our lively panel discussion. So I'll pick up exactly where Daniela left off. One of the most truly pernicious aspects of geopolitics in our moment right now is that the human has been weaponized, exactly as she said. Weapons of mass migration, a term that sadly had to be coined in the last few years when observing the way in which the Russian government and its proxies and allies, neighboring states, have been using migrants from developing countries who sought to otherwise be in Russia for work-related, domestic employment purposes, have been pushed towards the front line, pushed over the border, and in a way used as for human trafficking, human shields, and indeed as unwilling soldiers in the conflict right now. It's not the only place where this is going on, of course, as well. There's a whole genre around child soldiers, for example, which are prominent in other geographies. So, the not only exploitation of humans, but humans, again, of course, in violation of every possible international law or convention or treaty that we have, going back now almost a century, the weaponization of people, innocent people, is still a factor. And it's leading, ironically, despite the impetus for safe passage and migration that we should be promoting in our international diplomacy today. It's actually leading, of course, to a greater militarization of borders themselves. And so the data is probably already dated, but tens of billions of dollars that are being spent on border monitoring and control, rather than on the kinds of instruments to guarantee human security that we should be investing in. Again, deeply, deeply troubling. The only, and I don't want to call it a silver lining, but part of the intellectual evolution for those of us in this domain is that we've come to appreciate that whereas we used to talk in silos about the causes of migration, involuntary migration in particular, which is what we're dealing with here, we would categorize it into economic causes, economic insecurity, vulnerability, exploitation, trafficking, political causes, the traditional bucket of refugees and displaced peoples from conflict, and now, more recently, climate. But if you look today, right now as we speak, in the year 2026, it's roughly one-third, one-third, one-third on paper. Right, that one-third of migrants are caused by climate issues or displaced people. This could be domestic or cross-border, by climate issues, political issues, or economic issues. But you can also just rip this up, because what we have learned is that they're all deeply, deeply interconnected. When we look at the Syrian civil war, when we look at Sudan, when we look at any number of conflicts around the world, or the origin of outward involuntary migration, clearly these things are very multi-causal, right? It is never just one thing, the deeper you look. So to truly understand human security, we don't look at only economic issues, political issues, or climate issues, but really all of them. So it's deeply, deeply complex. Let me spend a moment or two, though, on that newest driver, if you will, which is climate, because this is the one that is not merely contingent. Right? It's not, war is an episode, it begins and it ends. Climate is becoming a deeply structural variable, and one that is, again, clearly accounting for a growing number of displaced people, and it doesn't look like it's going to simply reverse, right? You can posit ending a war and people returning home and societies rehabilitating themselves, but you can't really posit people returning to a place that has been devastated by drought. Once that hits, it's over, right? And it's over forever. And one of the things that I won't get into too much detail, but in your lifetimes, yourselves being the young leaders, that you will see happening, because it already is that there will be a new legal category of geography that has not existed before. I informally call it vacant states. Now, the definition of a state is that it has a fixed or permanent resident population and is recognized by its neighbors or other states under international law. But what happens when places have been entirely vacated? Quite literally, everyone has left, right? And that's going to happen in a number of countries, and it's going to be primarily due to climate. In the meantime, we have the tensions between and within countries over environmental resources, such as rivers. And so there are hotspots, whether it is mostly related, of course, to upstream damming of rivers and the downstream consequences in terms of volatility of flows. We're seeing this in the Near East. We're seeing it in Southeast Asia. These tend to fall into two categories: those places where floods are caused by this activity, and that leads to calamitous impact on agriculture and also forces migration, but then also drought-related. And when you have drought-related impact, again, people leave and probably can't really ever return. And so there is the growing risk of water wars, which is of course one of the most ironic phenomena, because water wars don't create more water. Putting it all together, climate is clearly becoming a structural geopolitical factor, and it operates in multiple domains that are very important for our emerging conversation around resilience. The first is GDP. Many of us study economics, macroeconomics. We take for granted the forecasts that we read from the IMF or World Bank every year. X economies are going to grow 5%, 8%, 9%. Today, you cannot make a realistic prediction about the GDP of any country in the year 2030 based upon conventional methodologies that are used by the most authoritative sources. be it the IMF or whomever. They're completely wrong. They're definitely wrong. They're off by material percentages, right? If a country only grows at 4 or 5%, and Swiss Re or other institutions predict that climate is going to have an impact or reduce their growth by something on the order of 15 to 20% per year in a year where you have a major climate shock, that means that by 2030 it will have grown very significantly less than what was forecasted. And this is applied not just to sort of, random off-the-map places. Just take India. India is the fastest growing economy in the world, one of the largest economies in the world, the most populous country in the world. And there's no way it's going to sustain the supposed 9-10% growth. If you look at a climate profile of India, it's quite literally one of the, if not the most climate stressed countries in the entire world, while also being home to 1.4 billion people. Our own internal work in my organization forecasts that India's economy will be about $750 billion less just 5 years from now than it's forecasted to be. That's very significant. That would change the investment rating of a country, right? It would change asset allocation if we were to use the truthful data around the impact of climate stress on human lives, because it applies to farmers, it applies to manufacturing, construction workers, and it most certainly even applies to those working in services in the delivery sector. Every sector of every economy is being affected. So it's a structural factor. Mass migrations, GDP impact, and so forth, indiscriminate impact on rich and poor. And let me just get to the mass migration issue and use a couple of examples. Again, multi-causal. The human insecurity is economic, it's geopolitical, and it's climate. And there's no better example than in the Near Eastern region. I don't need to tell anyone in Germany what the impact of this multi-causal human insecurity and conflict in countries that you thought were far away, how that's impacted Germany in exactly the last 10-year period, right? You could really go back 15 plus years, of course, to the original outbreak of the Arab Spring. And one of the things that concerns me right now, and I think it's a geography we might dig into in our conversation today, is very much in the news. If you look at the countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Iran in the news for different reasons, very fragile states at the moment, structurally fragile states, massively climate stressed, youth bulges, massive corruption. Again, very difficult to imagine the current political order in these societies leading to some magical, resurrection. And you have the climate triggers hitting with massive droughts and so forth. And they all border Turkey. Turkey is already home to the largest number of refugees of any country in the world. And just when you think you have it under control, these uncontrollable kinds of phenomena occur. And so that's something we have to be careful of, because the next Arab Spring, for a whole different reason, is already brewing, and we're not paying attention to it. So let me just transition quickly to our discussion and set the stage. What are we going to do about it, right? So I think that we can tackle these issues from the standpoint of human lives and what we do for people and what we do for places, to break it down simply. What we can do for people is more, if you will, technology forward, frictionless tools that unlock mobility in ways that are safe, that are documented, that are cooperative across borders, rather than leaving people simply to be stateless. And the technologies that we have that are available today, biometrics, blockchain, and so forth, could come together, and we could be issuing new kinds of documentation for people to help them as they live a life, of potentially perpetual mobility. So there's examples like that already underway. Some work that's being done, supported by international agencies and by NGOs, like Civitas, for example. The other is geographical. I spoke about vacant states on the one hand. Well, what's the flip side of that? It's what are the places that are going to inevitably be absorbing migrants, again, whatever the cause may be, and where are they going to go, and what are the geographies that are willing to host them. And there, too, there are some novel efforts underway to work with countries to provide incentives for them to be permanent hosts, in a way, to refugee populations, maybe even build entire new cities right? Find ways to integrate them into the economy and supply chains. And I think this is the kind of creative thinking that's going to be needed in the world we live in today, where you can't simply expect that people are just going to go from one place to another place, and when it's safe to go home, they go home again. That model is too neat, too simple, doesn't correspond to reality. So, this is, don't take this as real estate investment advice. This is really just about looking at the places in the world that at the moment, in an emergent way, appear to tick certain boxes. They are climate resilient, either based on climate models or based upon their own adaptation and engineering, like air conditioning, or resilient electricity grids, or places that are friendly to migrants, or places that have labor shortages. Ideally, we start to design and pursue policies in our societies to make ourselves more attractive, for people to build a better life and to assimilate in societies, because we actually face those labor shortages, as you know, here in Germany and elsewhere. And so the final point I'll make is just really about resilience itself. And I'm so glad that Catherine, that you've made it this topic, and that Daniela, you set it up so well. Resilience has been a very soft term, right? It's like beauty. You know it when you see it. That's not good enough anymore. As for you as young leaders, students, graduate students, young professionals, start to treat resilience like a science, right? As a rigorous policy domain. Measure it. It's the reason I started AlphaGeo, was because I was frustrated that people use this word resilience. That's so important, so vital to our survival in a complex world, and no one has a proof for it, a mathematical approach. What is it? What makes a place resilient? So this is just an illustrative screenshot, but what we do is literally to quantify the resilience of every place in the world, right down to the level of an address or a building. And what are the components of resilience? Well, it's many, many, many things. By now, we're trying to measure about 150 things about every single place. And it is everything from the crime rate to the availability of hospital beds per capita, to incomes, to water stress, to, again, electricity grid reliability. All of these things are components of resilience. The number one priority for every community, for every society in the world, should be to be more resilient, especially, most of all, for the people, for the individuals who live there. So with that, look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Thanks.
So we will have you sit right next to me over here. All right. So this wouldn't be an emerging leaders hub sort of event if you weren't the most flexible audience in the city of Munich this evening. All of you are very aware that we've had a few transport strikes and the like over the last 2 days. So you see over there an empty chair for David Miliband, who will be breezing into our auditorium momentarily. It also has meant that we are missing two vital perspectives this evening, which I really wanted to bring into this discussion, which is State Minister Serap Güler, who would have made it if she could have flown, but cannot make it if she takes the train, which is what she's doing now. And sadly, the perspective of my own former hometown mayor, Michelle Wu, who wanted to be with us. She will be eventually at the Munich Security Conference on Saturday. So when you catch a glimpse of her, I suggest that you listen intently on how some of these issues play out on the subnational level, because she has very interesting integrated issues on this. That is not a way to say you are making do with this wonderful panel. On the contrary, I want to introduce my panelists to you in just a minute. I'm Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook. I'm a senior advisor with the Bertelsmann Stiftung, working on sustainable market economies and resilience issues, as Parag pointed out. And before I introduce this panel to you, I want to add, well, throw in a couple monkey wrenches into what you said, Parag, to try to set up the sort of panoply of issues that we are confronted with, because I was most struck by the urgency of how you mapped both your analysis but the importance of resilience when you, of course, read the UNDP's Human Development Index, which right around the pandemic estimated that we had collectively, as a human race, lost about 5 years of our thriving because of the pandemic and all of the connected and interconnected effects. And in their analysis in 2021 and the new report 2026, all the reports, they map some of the metric indicators that you noted and the knock-on effects, which is to say things like GDP, exports, imports, the classic pieces, but also access to electricity, to water, to fundamentally to education. They look at income inequality, all the multidimensional effects of poverty, and they sort of pull that together within also a wider health context. And post-COVID, the HCI said, now we're facing a new uncertainty complex. And so they threw more issues on top of the complex picture you've already painted, which is to say, and we saw this very clearly around the pandemic, widespread and intensifying political and societal polarization around issues like facts. Aha, watch me make magic. Ta-da! I just announced that you were going to breeze in. So, David Miliband, everybody. I'm still in my introduction, so you're all good. The dangerous planetary climate change, and then sweeping societal industrial transformation. Because for all the youth bubbles you noted, technology aims to offer some solutions, but of course that's in an sort of unequal mix. So now, with the accelerating effects of the weaponization of humans, and fundamentally shifts that we've seen over the last year, which is an eradication of the aid floor provided by a lot of Western societies who have come in, traditionally to mitigate these calamities that we've now mapped. We end up with something that the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, in combination with the Rockefeller Foundation, found that those overall cuts to the human thriving infrastructure mean an additional 22.6 million deaths by 2030. That's in 4 years. And IRC has done work on this, but Oxfam estimates that these kind of shifts, or that undercutting, cross-cutting piece, that we're losing resources for this work to think this through, that could mean that a child could die, under 5, could die every 40 seconds. So I think that is sort of the dire piece surrounding what you presented, Parag, and that's where we want to dive right in, which is to say this is as ripe and urgent as any spiking conflict some of the great powers might lead you to believe, because it has the immediate effects, the mid-range effects, but then certainly the long-term effects on all of our human thriving. So now you've heard me filibuster enough. David Miliband is here, and I can introduce the rest of my panel, which I'm happy to do. So to the right of Parag is Dr. Kira Finke, no stranger to this stage because we've shared here at the Amerikahaus together. She's the Deputy Research Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Her area of specialty is climate change and migration. She's the head of the Center for Climate Change and Foreign Policy, and also an advisory board member to the federal government for the federal government effort for civilian crisis prevention and peace building, which she's been doing a number of years. And she wrote a very interesting book, which I commend to you, on the effects of climate migration. So welcome, Dr. Kira Finke.
Thank you so much.
Not only are you all emerging leaders, but we have one of the finest emerging leaders among us in Katja Zitsch. We met last year at a Vatican-sponsored conference on the ramifications of climate change and health. Katja is a leader in this space, has been incredibly active in the WHO Youth Council. She's a background in medicine. She's a project associate at the Slovenian National Institute of Public Health. And she's really been the backbone of some of the institutional infrastructure that some of the great powers would think would now be, ripe for capping, which is to say the resources that have left the World Health Organization. Katja is among those who are keeping that infrastructure together. She's done work on the intersection of the environment and health, and she chairs at the WHO Youth Council the Working Group on Planetary Health. So welcome, Katja. And breezing in from Berlin is David Miliband. Well, from Nairobi via Berlin, right? No, from Nairobi proper. You didn't even get to stop off. Okay. Is the President CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees, as many of you know, the agency's operations in 40 crisis-affected countries. He's also been spearheading an initiative which I find vitally important now, which is the Atlas of Impunity, which is part of the question about how on earth, truly, do large powers, resource powers, get away with what they seemingly get away with in the context and breaking of potential groundings of international law. But of course, you know, the IRC, as you know, serves 36.5 million people in countries affected by crisis, with all ramifications that come with it. But David has had various vantage points on this through his long political career, not least before moving to New York for the IRC, where he was the UK Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. Welcome, David. David, you missed Parag's excellent presentation, but I really want to let Kira and Katya react to it, first of all, from their vantage point. I like the narrative arc because we got a lot of sort of hope and possibilities at the end, but there are some really stark realities on resources, on the fight for fundamental resource to make some of the wonderful solutions that Parag promised, these sort of ways of getting people to move around the world in a sustainable, functional way, to make that happen. Is he too optimistic? Is he right on the money? Is that something that you're observing in your own work? What is your take?
Can I start?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I found many things fascinating about your talk, and in particular, what caught my attention was this question of, will some regions empty out or not? Yeah, will there be an outflow of people? And the way I think about it is habitability. It is, of course, in the age of climate change, defined by how extreme these climatic events will become. Yeah? So this has to do also with our capacity to mitigate climate change. But on the other hand, we also know that humans have been able to live and sometimes even thrive in areas that are somehow inhospitable, right? So this also depends on how much capacity can we devote to keep certain areas habitable. Right, so financial capacity, technological capacity, etc. So we all know maybe the examples. We had this great meeting yesterday with the president of the Maldives, who is fighting for the survival of his island nation because it is so low-lying. It's a coral atoll, and it only rises a few meters above sea level. And of course, you can think of all types of adaptation for these low-lying coral atolls, from floating islands to huge infrastructure to land reclamation. But of course, the question is, with increasing impacts, how will the resources be allocated? Right. And will they be allocated to very poor areas? And of course, the answer is, in many cases, no. And maybe this is actually where also some of these conflict lines that you have also alluded to will spark up. The question is, which places will we keep habitable through investments, through also human capacity, through innovation, and
who gets to decide that?
And who gets to decide
God?
this? And which
right.
exactly? And which projections do we use to make maybe anticipatory questions?
Right.
And a fundament to this type of thinking of how can we become resilient in the face of climate change are human rights, because of course there can be different ways of emptying an area. It can be voluntary anticipatory migration. It can be very undignified migration that is happening in reaction to a strong climatic event. But it can also mean thinking about human rights and when is an area still able to support the implementation of basic human rights and when is it not. And I think this is very fundamental if we talk about resilience in this context.
Katya, when you heard Parag talk about the idea of these vacant spaces and the obligation to care for those who then come, who put themselves on the move, and I thought the first slide was particularly striking, also the weaponization of human suffering, the weaponization of human movement, and the weaponization of human need. When you look from your profession at it from, the Asclepian conviction that you have to help all who suffer, How do you read this from the perspective of the work that you do with the WHO?
In very short, it's weird. No, but just to kind of explain where I'm coming from. Because if you think about it, you know, health action or climate action, they are economic policy, they are foreign policy, they are, you know, security policy. So having these vacancies kind of exist, you see that the mindset of a lot of the world has shifted from this collaboration, from solidarity, and going more into geopolitical competition, which just fractures the whole system. And it's interesting to me that people, instead of deciding to reform multilateralism, if you see that it doesn't work, they instead prefer to abandon it. And when I was listening to the initial presentation, the first word I wrote down as like a thought was permacrisis, and I underlined it. And that has been a hot, trendy word throughout WHO for the past 2 years. And if you know what has been happening with the US and now even Argentina leaving the World Health Organization, the whole organization needed to be restructured. And you start thinking about how did we let it get so far that permacrisis, either that we're living in times of where multiple crises exist at the same time, or we're living in a crisis that lasts for so long, it seems like it doesn't have any end. And then we go back to what we can do and how we can fill those gaps that exist there. And it's about kind of like going from the narrative of us living in a dystopian movie right now, because that's practically how it feels like for a young person, I would say, is that we need to kind of think about it from a different angle. And like Varan said, instead of, you know, treasuring what we measure, we need to measure what we treasure. So we need to figure out how to go beyond GDP and how to figure out the things that make us healthy, things that make us happy, things that, you know, make us a kind society. How can we make sure that that helps us fill those gaps?
David, you've only just arrived, but of course you think about this day in and day out, morning, noon, and night, whatever time zone you're in. In particular now, as we've heard these three already say, exacerbated by the fact that major support infrastructures are seemingly not only stepping away, but then creating injury within the system to their own people, frankly. America is the country where the measles are going to come back as a massive disease. But then fundamentally to the world. So with all the resources here that are needed, how do we even where do we even begin?
Well, first of all, my real qualification for being here is I'm a big fan of Catherine's and think that the work she does is very important. And I sincerely apologize to Parag for missing his presentation. And I doubly apologize that not only have I arrived a little bit late, but I'm going to have to leave at about
filibustered through that
quarter to or 10 to 8 because I'm supposed to host a dinner. So a lot of apologies. I mean, the first thing I would say is that we should never forget that there are more resources to do more good than at any time in human history.
Thank you.
And I don't want anecdotes to take the place of data, but if this meeting was happening in Saudi Arabia, for the sake of argument, many, many women in the audience would say there's never been a better time to be a woman in Saudi Arabia than today. Their life opportunities are greater than ever. I hazard to say that if we had this meeting in Mumbai, there'd also be many people coming forward to say there's never been a better time to be an Indian alive. Not everyone would say that, but many would say that. And so what I would draw attention to is that there are more resources to do more good than any time in human history. That the real sin is man-made, not natural. And the sin has one essential element, which is that the benefits are being grotesquely unequally distributed, and the risks of the present moment are being borne, especially in the conflict states that you refer to in your, or the parts of conflict states that you refer to in the title of this meeting. And just to give a bit of data that maybe wasn't covered in Parag's opening, there are 60 conflicts going on in 2020. Will you send me your presentation, by the way? but there are 60 conflicts going on. 20 countries account for 90% of humanitarian need, which means that you depend on aid organizations like mine to survive. 90% effectively of the world's forcibly displaced live in those 20 countries.
Right.
I always think, if you say there are 250 million people in humanitarian need, 800 million people live in poverty on less than $3 a day, it can almost seem like scaling Mount Everest. If you say, look, there are 20 countries that have 90% of the extreme poor, of the humanitarian need, it becomes more manageable because it's the most extreme version of a generalized problem in the midst of what is essentially a rising tide. Now, the one additional point I'd make, which goes to your point about measles, I mean, there's a long history that when rising powers challenge dominant powers, there's a great danger that the global public goods on which we all depend don't get serviced. And that, it seems to me, is the great danger of this moment. I would describe America's role, certainly after 1990 and really after 1945, it was the anchor of the global system.
Right.
And the current administration has said, we don't want to be the anchor of the global system anymore. And the trouble is that the anchor has been pulled up. The stabilization that provided for all of the mistakes that may have been made historically, the anchor hasn't been replaced. And that's what's leading, I think, to these extremities of risk being borne by people in conflict states as one example of the current moment. That is an addressable problem. It's not a unmanageable problem. And I think that's the way I would frame this discussion we're having tonight.
Parag, who steps up? So as David has framed it, he's reframed the narrative. He's reframed the narrative as a narrative of possibilities. In order to get to your last slide, where and the designs where there's more an accountable freedom of movement that is aligned with labor markets, but also human need, the kind of sort of hopeful image you left us with. Who steps up?
You asked this question earlier, which I'm glad wasn't rhetorical. You said, who gets to decide where the adaptation takes place? Who gets to play God was almost the framing. And that's actually quite literally, it's not a rhetorical question, because it goes back to something very fundamental, which is almost economic in understanding how resilience operates, which is that it's not a global public good. When we talk about things like combating climate change, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, that's a global public good. Any contribution you make by closing a coal-fired power plant reduces overall emissions, and those benefits are somehow shared, on a planetary basis. Adaptation at a local level, fortifying your society, building a seawall or improving living conditions, that's a local private good, right? It's in some ways, it's not the opposite, but it's a substitute. So you will not see a global commitment of resources to adaptation, because adaptation, when I live in the country of Singapore, if we build a seawall, it's great for us, but it does nothing for the people in Africa. So adaptation really, even though it's a good thing to do, almost follows from the logic of fragmentation that David was pointing to, because everyone's saying, well, in this world where there's no global leadership, I'm just going to adapt myself and become more resilient for myself. To hell with everyone else. However, of course, we do live in an interconnected world, and you're going to have these spillover effects. So for those of us who are old enough, you may remember the Barcelona process of the early 1990s. It was when European governments talked about providing enormous sums of investment and aid and resources to North African societies to create jobs and to make their societies, to modernize them, to prevent mass migration flows. Well, too little, too late, right? Almost nothing was done then to help them adapt, and you have the results that you have today. So, and the final related point that follows from all of this is migration, unfortunately, doesn't have global governance, right? Of all the things where we might have global governance and global coordination, such as environment, arms control, or we used to have until yesterday, global arms control treaties. The one thing that I'm sad to report, and there's multiple of us up here that have done nothing but obsess about migration, so correct me if I'm wrong, but there will literally never be global coordination. This is the one single thing. And again, goes back to the tragedy of what I was saying at the beginning, and David lives this every day. Migration is the final vestige. Controlling migration is the final vestige of state sovereignty. Right? That's just a fancy way of saying when your sovereignty's been stripped away, when international law or whatever forces lead a state to no longer control certain aspects of its policy, the one thing that it will still try to control is the movement of people across its borders. That one last thing, right? And therefore, you're never going to have a global regime. So the real answer to your question is that it's going to be incredibly local and bilateral, right? One country and another country operating in a pair almost become first movers. Look at the Spanish Prime Minister made headlines just a few days ago with his op-ed in the New York Times saying, we are pro-migration, right? And Spain has a specific set of bilateral relationships, and it is seeking to normalize the migrants from those countries and give them a rapid pathway towards citizenship and so forth. And other countries may see that and follow suit with their pairs of partner countries. And it's going to be something that's bottom up through positive demonstration effects. But do not hope ever for some kind of global migration accord that is humane, decent, humanitarian. I believe that will sadly never, ever, ever happen.
David, do you share that pessimism, maybe? Is that the right word?
Well, I think that we're in a world where multiple coalitions of multiple countries are the most likely and best hope. I think there's often a danger that we talk about transactionalism as being about self-interest and multilateralism as being about selflessness. In fact, I think that's wrong. I mean, multilateralism is in the enlightened self-interest. Yeah. And I think so it's a matter of whether you're short-term greedy or long-term greedy. And I think that the global standards are being honoured in breach rather than observance. But there are countries that want to stand by them and use them as the baseline, because we shouldn't forget that the rules that were established after 1945, and by the way, universally established, were not grandiose. I mean, the right not to be sent back to somewhere where you're going to be persecuted is or killed is a very basic, it's called a fundamental right because it's basic, not because it's grandiose. The right to a civilian in a war zone who we're trying to help, the legal right to aid is not a grandiose entitlement, it's a very basic entitlement. And I think that it's a measure of, in some ways, how things have fallen, that it's going to be coalitions of countries that come together. The phrase coalitions of the willing that doesn't have a great history, but I think it's where we are, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should try and seize it, because it's better than not having coalitions of the willing. The danger is that the unwilling hold the rest to ransom.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think, and Parag's first slide is that. Not only do they hold them for ransom, but they turn these vulnerabilities into something that they can then weaponize, such that you could potentially think about impacting the nascent coalition of, or nascent systems that might build around that. I mean, your first slide showed that, if you were, I've been quoting an American state philosopher who was the governor of New York, thinking about the American Constitution a lot, and he said about the American Constitution, you'd only have to be ambitious and villainous enough that you could use the American Constitution to ruin the country, which is to say your best system can also be turned on its head. I mean, I want to get Kira in on this in particular, but this is a good floor for something that could happen if you don't have a whole system that's continuously trying to weaken even these first or these sort of nascent efforts because it serves a short-term objective. I mean, is that, you still have to forge ahead in some way. So Kira, who do you see forging ahead? Do you see that happening? And who's in this coalition potentially of those more adept, potentially willing?
Well, we just published a paper series that's called Global Reordering, right? So right now we are in this moment of reshuffling where it's very uncertain what will happen after this attack on the international system will maybe subside, and what will emerge from this. Right. Will there be a significant reform? Will there be a group of countries that forge some sort of like-minded alliance to protect the global commons, or what will happen? I think right now it's kind of difficult to foresee that, because geopolitics are changing, of course, because of these tensions, the conflict that we are seeing, but it's also fundamentally changing because geographies are changing. Yeah? Climate change is changing borders, so and it's changing the resources. The renewable transition, the digital transformation, they are changing the types of resources that will make humanity thrive in the future, right? So where do we have our industrial bases today? It's often located where coal was found, many years ago. But maybe in the future it will be more closer to areas where there's offshore wind availability. So there may be this big shift. If you think about spheres of influence, of course, we see some just thinking of this as territorial influence.
And short-termism, yeah.
Exactly, but at the same time, we are also seeing digital spheres of influence emerging, right? That's becoming a very important sphere of influence, disinformation spreading, etc. So you have these different spheres, also in a way somehow even competing, and I think this has also implications for powers of nation states, where they will want to build their powers. Is it only in terms of geography, like in sort of very traditional sense of this, or is it in a different way that also includes this digital spheres of influence, like Russia is doing? Yeah, they are spreading false information, narratives from extremists are being infiltrated into our societies, into our youth. Yeah, so I think this is important to think about when we look at also an emerging system that may be built on what is left after this U.S. administration.
When the emergency is obvious, Katja, like as we've seen with the World Health Organization, when there's things at stake that are vital to the understanding of human thriving, which is health data, data and information on, immunizations, on what keeps us fundamentally thriving, what roles do other sectors play to come? Now we've sort of mapped out what the longer vision is, but the WHO, in the loss of its funding, and that's a direct attack, which has a lot of vital components for human thriving built in. What organizations come to save not only the structure of the WHO, but what lies behind it, what it has meant for humanity? Do you see, what's the coalition of the willing there? Is there enough saving going on?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I'll try to break it down a little bit. So with everything that we have been facing when it comes to the WHO, the Youth Council, just people in general, all of us remember the COVID pandemic. So you saw how the world literally broke down because of one singular health issue that we weren't prepared for. And already 3 years after, we act as if it never happened, or we even use it as a politicized excuse to do our own agenda. So when it comes to human thriving, we are currently forgetting that human thriving is not a luxury, it should be infrastructure. And currently, what I would say is that the main religion in the world currently is actually capitalism. But if you think about it, economic growth cannot be infinite, because we have finite resources, such as water, such as, for example, food, such as nature, and so on. So we need to take care of that. So we need to kind of reinvest in the well-being of the planet, as well as later on the humanity itself. Because, if you think about it from that perspective, if you think that economy is more important than, let's say, air pollution, try holding your breath and counting your money and see how far you get. It doesn't, hold water. So when it comes to health, that is where these organizations need to come in. And it's not talking about the World Health Organization or the UN or Germany or US or Slovenia, where I come from. But it's also about, the local communities that work together, the NGOs, the youth organizations that are literally that last mile drivers that will put policies into place, but also act as watchdogs when policy is, well, technically a failure. So we need to kind of come together and figure out how we can put together an intergenerational dialogue so that we make sure that young people are co-creators of the policies that we are talking about today, instead of just being as oftentimes you will hear, young people are the future of the world, but that's an immense burden on the shoulders of youth. We need to start working on solving the situation now, and we need to do it together. So that means that, yes, you do need organizations like the UN and WHO, which admittedly are quite rigid in its structure, so it can be a little bit hard for them to adapt to current issues, especially the novel ones that are emerging. But at the same time, that does provide you with a certain framework, with a certain safety in which we can operate. So then you have the NGOs, the youth organizations that come in, and a lot of them oftentimes have to do with what we would call a part of, the humanitarian response or humanitarian aid. But the problem is that when it comes to times of crisis, oftentimes we start, putting that burden onto the NGOs, onto these like small organizations, instead of investing in public systems that would make it a systematic structure that will help people in general. So just thinking from that perspective, we need to put, climate action and health at the core of the argument that we are currently discussing, because without health, there's literally nothing you can do, because you will not be able to work, you will not be able to go to school, you will not be able to have a family, and same goes for the health of the planet. So that's where I think that collaboration is truly, truly necessary. But the way is, how do we systematize it? How do we make sure that collaboration is actually truly meaningful? And I'm speaking mostly from my perspective as a youth activist and a WHO Youth Council member, where we have had a lot of experiences where that engagement was not truly meaningful. And the first step in kind of our way forward is teaching institutions, and that includes ministries and governments and parliamentarians, on how to actually engage with young people, because the easiest way to learn how to do that is to simply ask, and young people will tell you.
David, how has the IRC learned some of those integrated issues that Katja's, because you have expanded your work deeply into health, into questions of maternal health, into questions of women's health, women as the node of systems, and then also into intergenerational work. How does the IRC see itself as part of the space holding for what Katja is describing that we need?
Well, I think a couple of things are important. Just for people's benefit, we're an international humanitarian aid agency. We focus on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster, so we're not a general anti-poverty agency. We're focused on people who are especially vulnerable because of war and disaster. Sadly, there are more of them than ever before. First, when I was in politics, I used to believe that hope led to action. Now I think that was wrong. It's action that leads to hope. So doing something is actually the best way of fueling hope. And I have great respect for those who want to influence policy. That's great. But there are others who just want to go and do something. And that's equally valid. Secondly, I understand the attraction of believing that the only sustainable solutions are government solutions. But I think that's wrong, actually. Thriving societies, as opposed to just human thriving societies, yes, have effective and accountable governance, but they also have a dynamic and innovative private sector, and they have a free civil society. And the narrow corridor, to quote the title of a book, the narrow corridor between a state that's too strong and a state that's too weak is one in which private sector and civil society are free enough to hold government accountable. And just to give you a very practical example of what that means, Gavi said to us 5 years ago, we've plateaued on immunization of under fives because governments can't reach the 200 million people who live in war-affected areas. And expecting people to get to health clinics or to get a vaccination isn't going to work. They said, can you find 2 million zero-dose kids in war-torn areas of 4 countries in East Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia? Can you find 2 million zero-dose kids? We found them. We negotiated with the local armed groups. We've delivered now to those 4 countries, plus to Yemen and Chad, 24 million doses of vaccine in the last 3 or 4 years. And we are finding that we can do it at $2.20 a shot. So civil society isn't just a sort of supplement or an advisor to government, it's a sustainable replacement where governments can't reach. Thirdly, I was just learning this week in Nairobi, you talked about, I think you talked about women-led groups, and we've expanded our maternity provision, which has historically been very strong. We now have, thanks to our research and development arm, our innovation arm, Airbell, 100,000 women a month signing up for injectable contraception in South Sudan alone. So the idea that I think it's really important to say civil society, because it's local, is often thought to be boutique and small. It can scale. And scaling is not something we should be afraid of. It's something we should be seeking to build into the most basic ways that we work. That's how you end up helping 36 million people. Sadly, that was a number for 2024. As a result of the cuts in humanitarian aid, last year, 8 million people have lost access to IRC services. 2 million completely lost their services. 6 million partially lost their services. So our numbers for 2025 will be smaller, but nonetheless, you have to think about how civil society scales, and it scales in partnership with local NGOs, international NGOs, etc. So I think there's a scaling part of this. Finally, don't worry, there's not 15 points here. The last thing I'd say is that we have styled ourselves as the solution makers, the reformers of the humanitarian aid system. It's tempting when you're facing cuts to just try and do more of the same. Actually, that's a recipe for disaster. If you just go into a defensive crouch, you're not going to serve people. We've actually doubled down on our innovation. So, for example, today we're using AI to photograph lesions of people who fear they've got Mpox in Democratic Republic of Congo. We compare it to a data set, 98% confidence you can give a diagnosis within 90 seconds, rather than sending blood samples to Kinshasa and 2 weeks later getting a result. But the resources that are becoming available in the industrialized parts of the world, in the richer parts of the world, will end up exacerbating the inequalities unless we make a real attempt to overcome those inequalities and bring the extraordinary technological advances that are coming forward to the people who are being left behind. So I think that determination to be self-critical and to reform systems rather than just try to stretch food parcels as far as they'll go is really important.
Parag, I mean, that's a nexus that you have worked in and with AlphaGeo. First of all, identifying the need where the resilient and adaptive strategies are, but also how to get the private sector to buy into, well, maybe this is positive dual use, how to combine their innovations to increase, the adaptive capacity, but also the solution capacity while serving a bottom line. So from your perspective, is there a hunger and appetite to make these connections and broaden that aperture in the way that David has described with key private sector
Absolutely.
interests?
Well, first, let me underscore 2 points that David made. First is that extraordinary example of just using photo imagery to, with high accuracy, diagnose a condition. That's amazing. That's the kind of leapfrogging that we need to see. And leapfrogging is a term that goes back 20 years. I'm looking at microfinance and so on. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in that, and this is a phenomenal example. And it's great that, again, in that spirit of the second great point you made about multi-stakeholder coalitions being the new mode of governance, it's not really all about the state, because that actually becomes a downward spiral, because, you're talking about fragile states where you have weak state capacity. How do you expect the state to magically have the capacity? What you really need is to be thinking about each society is going to be its own constellation of actors, public, private, civic, whatever the case may be. So I think that's really important. And then that leads to, and I should say a plug for both of us, I'm very actively we're working together actually to get AlphaGeo data in the hands of IRC folks out in the field so they can just anticipate what the climate shocks might be that are coming so that they can respond accordingly in terms of where they position assets. So again, geospatial technology being used at the ground level. So now to your point about the private sector and investors, let me give two quick answers. One is public and one is private. But from the private sector standpoint, those that are asset owners, whether they are family offices or sovereign wealth funds, which again are sort of quasi-public parastatals as they're known, but still let's treat them like investors who are looking at a long-term bottom line. They are now immensely concerned with the question of resilience in ways that short-term oriented, publicly listed companies or private equity, have not proven themselves to be. So thankfully, the pool of capital that represents trillions, not just mere billions, right? The pool that represents trillions is super concerned about resilience. It's deeply embedded now in how they're thinking about how they invest, right? Which societies are maintaining stability and investing in resilience so that they are investable, right? Their public markets, for example.
Right, and they're reducing risk
exactly.
actively.
And then which companies should you be investing in that are going to have sustainable business models that are going to actually lead to appreciating asset values over a decadal time frame, not
so
just the next
some
quarter.
security frame too.
So that's where I see a lot of promise. And then the second quick part of the answer is on public sector in terms of governments. Those that are actually looking, using scenario planning, using big data, using these simulations around the implications of what's happening in climate and geopolitics and supply chain disruptions and conflict to figure out where do they fit in all of this and what are they going to need to do to be more resilient. So this is, again, not a universally applicable statement, but at least a growing number of governments that we see want to embrace the idea of resilience, want to measure it for their own country, and want to devote resources to enacting policies that are going to sort of shield them.
Because Kira's been so active in the German national crisis prevention work, I'm going to ask her about how Germany's doing on that indicator. But I also want to get you ready to ask some questions, because lo and behold, we're already coming up on witching hour, and David I have to let go in 3.5 minutes. So if you have a particular question for David Miliband, get that ready now. I'm going to ask Kira to say 35 seconds worth of something, and then you all get to ask David before he departs, and then we can let this conversation flow out. So Kira, on this particular piece, because we don't have the state minister with us, how's Germany doing on the data forecasting, the technology use, the field implementation, all the solutions we've heard when it feels it needs to maybe pick up some of what was lost from the United States?
I mean, I'm sure she would say something different than I'm about to say.
But that's why I'm asking you specifically.
So, of course, in my view, prevention has taken a backseat to crisis management. So I think in many areas, our actions lag far behind our knowledge also. And Germany is not alone in this problem. There's many countries who share this challenge. But I think we are also being held back by some overburdening bureaucracy. We are being held back by polarizing debates, some of them influenced by Russian disinformation. And I think we need to improve our discernment between what is right and what is wrong and what is needed now and how we can prevent looming crises that are already emerging, that are already materializing, but the full effects of which are being set off now. For example, biodiversity loss, for example, climate change, but the full brunt of it will only be felt maybe in a decade from now, maybe even longer time frames.
Do you feel like there are frames in which to bring in that kind of data, that kind of knowledge, that's some of the academic work, that's some of the, the work that's being done far outside the state environment? Are there new spaces in where that exchange of information is happening?
Yeah, I mean, right now there's the Cyber Innovation Hub by the Bundeswehr, so I think they are really trying to bring innovation also into different fields of crisis prevention, of the question of how we can become more resilient and how we can exercise power in different spheres. Yeah, so. But I think as Germany is discussing a lot, of course, about its military capabilities, we also have to invest in our other capabilities, including investing in crisis prevention, investing in multilateralism. These are all sources of power, and these are all sources of resilience in a way. So I think we have to think about this, what we often call soft power element, as really being a strong part of the equation.
I appreciate that, because you have a bunch of taxpayers in front of you who also need to figure out how they're going to pay for that. Okay, so David has 30 seconds to respond to your very urgent question, and then we're going to excuse him. I think we have microphones coming from the back. You just introduce yourself, make sure that whatever you say ends with your voice going up, indicating a question.
Can you hear me? Ram Stevens, professor of medicine from Chicago. Been working in Ukraine, and I wonder, Mr. Millerbrand, if you could just briefly explain where your focus has been in Ukraine and how you try to deal with a myriad of issues and work with the Ministry of Health.
Yeah. First of all, one of the themes that I think has come through the contributions is to fight against the term learned helplessness. I mean, learned helplessness is a term from psychology, I think. What all of the contributors have spoken about tonight is that learned helplessness is a choice, not a fate.
Yeah.
And we should not succumb to learned helplessness. And it relates to the professor's question, because I think what the Ukrainian people have taught us over the last 4 years, and actually longer, is not to accept learned helplessness. And in a remarkable way, the fight against learned helplessness, be it physical learned helplessness or mental learned helplessness, is really very, very striking in the Ukrainian case. Our own work in Ukraine is very much focused on the themes that I described earlier. So we work in the northeast of the country from Kharkiv, in the east of the country from Dnipro, in the southeast of the country from Mykolaiv or a bit further in. And our focus has been in 3 areas, really. One is mobile health for communities near the front line who can't move. I mean, all of our services are actually for communities, especially elderly people, sometimes disabled people who can't move or choose not to move. So mobile health has been quite an important part of what we do. We've been part of a cash consortium to make sure that our clients are able to support themselves if they're not able to move. And then thirdly, psychosocial support, social care, social work in crisis. And that we've tried to dovetail that with the expertise of Ukrainian civil society as well as with the Ukrainian government. Most of our funding in Ukraine has come actually from private sources rather than from governmental sources, although the EU have supported us. And I think it's also worth saying that because we work across the arc of crisis, from the conflict to the internal displacement to the people who are refugees, we're also working in Poland, in Germany, in the UK actually, with refugees. And one of our jobs is to try and keep them connected with people who are with their families who are in Ukraine. So it's not a bad example of working to supplement, complement the state. I would say that the Ukraine crisis is an unusual example in many cases amongst the 61 conflicts of 2025, not least because it represents a conflict between states rather than an externally sponsored conflict within states. I mean, Sudan is much more the avatar for modern conflict with external sponsorship of groups within Sudan. The Ukraine case is obviously a different one with the Russian full-scale invasion. Actually, whenever I come to Munich, it's the 4th anniversary of the meeting that happened a few days before the Russian invasion, with many people saying it's not going to happen, but actually informed people from the intelligence side saying it is going to happen. But that's the answer to the question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again,
You are excused.
renewed apologies, but real thanks to the rest of the panel. Yep.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Well, we've opened the floor already. We have about 10 minutes. You are privy to being able to continue this discussion, by the way, with a lovely reception that will be just outside to follow. All these folks will be here for more in-depth questions, but let's try to get in as many as we can right now. I have one right here in the center and then one right over here.
There were a couple of mentions of adversaries using our own systems against us, our own openness against us. So I was wondering, both for external and internal, how do we protect ourselves, right? So you have Russia, for example, on the social media, spreading disinformation, dividing our societies. That's one example. Another is you have internal actors who, will use our systems of democracy to undermine democracy. So it's kind of a two-part question. It is a two-part question, but they're related. How do we protect ourselves while keeping our values?
Great set of questions. Can we go ahead and take the second question to go with from Kakshi over here? Perfect, you have your microphone.
Okay, hi, I'm Kangshi. I'm a current German Chancellor Fellow, just situating myself here, and I'm also from India, so very interesting remarks by Parag, thank you so much. There are two questions. One is basically on the geoanalytics that you mentioned. How do we make sure that it is not being weaponized in turn for capital abandonment and rather raises that, civil engagement to invest more capital in places where you're doing 150 indicators are no less, right? And it could lead to a lot of, while it is not a real estate advice, but if people do get access to that kind of data, they could become very skeptical of those regions and pull out. So that is one. And the second one is about the economic forecasting that you mentioned about GDPs. Do you have already an insight into what needs to be corrected in these models? And who's going to take those decisions, and what will mainstream those policy discussions? Where is it even being discussed as of now? That's a very unique insight that you've provided. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kakshi. Okay, Parag, we're going to have you, and then we're going to go to Kira on how do we make ourselves more resilient on the inside. Kira and Katya. You go ahead and start with that. Sorry.
Sure. So let me take the second question first. There's a lot of, I don't want to say competing, but just parallel and overlapping efforts around methodology for econometric forecasting to bring in these exogenous factors like climate. There isn't going to be one standard approach. It just comes down to the discount rate that's applied to specific sectors of an economy in different places under different conditions, and how you weight that, and so forth. And it should really just be dynamic. As data comes in, you modify your forecast. It's not that you make a linear projection today and you stick with it for the next 10 years. So that's the short answer. And I think it's a very lively area, and it should be. And it kind of, it perhaps goes to your point about what are we measuring, what's worth measuring, right? Just GDP for the sake of it, to what end, right? So there's a broader body of work, which is not really related to this per se, it's adjacent, which is just on well-being, right? What are well-being metrics? And I'd love to hear more about that. And the more that all of you can take up that research agenda and be active, the more there'll be a tipping point in the broader consciousness about moving away from traditional metrics that don't necessarily tell us about the true quality of life. And then to your point about, sort of data being, used inappropriately, this is something we faced from day one. It's known as the crowded trade. So if you put out information that says, such and such places are going to be the best place to be in the future, well, then those that have access to capital and to that knowledge are going to be first movers and gentrify certain places and so forth. So we're pretty, we're conscious of that. We're not trying not to let the data, fall into the hands of those who would undertake a strategy like that. But there's a lot of friction in the real world anyway. You can't just go and, buy Canada, right? Well, some have tried. Or if you can't buy it, you might try something else. But I don't want to give anyone any ideas. So that's one piece of it. But more importantly, to your point about how do you avoid, let's not focus on that fringe case of preppers trying to build their own country. Let's focus on preventing the downside, which is the most important part of your question because it applies to the most people. So in finance, there's this term alpha, right? Outperforming a market benchmark, and so what we call it is adaptation alpha. Investing in adaptation should result in an upside, not abandoning a place. A place becomes more investable, more desirable, more likely to thrive and succeed and perform well in the future if they invest now in adapting their infrastructure, improving the conditions there. So we try to put a positive spin on it, and we call it adaptation alpha, and that's the term that is actually being used, not just in some cute way. Bloomberg uses it, and they have built a whole index around it. So it just shows that there is a market for not abandoning places. To the contrary, right? There's a lot of effort going into using data to encourage incentivize positive investment behavior.
Well, in a way, that's already an answer to our first question. But Kira and Katja, how do we make ourselves resilient from the inside so that the entire structure doesn't get refracted?
I think we have to invest in our sovereignty. I think this is a very important aspect of it. We want to be interconnected, and we will remain interconnected with many countries. But we need to build a more diversified supply chain of specific goods, especially for Germany. Speaking for Germany, especially energy. And in Europe, we are also very dependent on fossil fuel imports. Many of these imports are coming from countries that are not like our-minded, that are autocracies often. And we need to invest in our own energy supply, which is renewable energies, and also circular economy. So I think this is really a matter of sovereignty, because we are importing 98% of our oil to the European Union and more than 88% of our gas supplies. And even if there's some effort to increase this somehow, the local production, this will still more or less stay the same. Yeah?
Right.
So we need to invest in our sovereignty, and this is also including the digital sphere. So in the digital sphere, the question is, how can we become less dependent on certain providers of social media? How can we build a European infrastructure of social media platforms? How can we use search engines such as Ecosia, for example, that are more independent than other providers? So I think this is really a key, and some of these investments require a sort of security premium. Yeah, so if you have to diversify from, for example, the cheapest provider also of components of renewable energies, for example, in this case, China, if you have to diversify away from that, that means maybe you will have to choose a provider that is slightly more expensive. And this is very difficult for companies to do, or for some companies impossible to do. So the question is, how do we distribute this burden of investment, and are consumers willing to pay for this, or are taxpayers willing to pay for this, so that we can invest in our security as sort of an integrated security, that thinks about the future. Daniela Schwarzer said at the beginning, future-proofing the solutions. But that also takes, of course, into account the crisis of the present. Nobody needs to ignore those. We need to act on the crisis of the present, but we need to also prepare and prevent.
Katja, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would actually link what Kira said with what David said before about the role of civil society, because while, yes, they hold a lot of soft power and so on, it's meaningless if we don't invest in them. It's meaningless if we don't invest. And I'm not talking just about financial investment. I'm talking about information. I'm talking about recognition. I'm talking about visibility. Because if we don't invest in civil society, and that means youth organizations, it means patient organizations, it means people with lived experience, disability, and so on. So we need to support them in order for them to be able to do what they do in the communities and in the societies. And linking that to what Kira just said about the role of social media, I think before we get to the water wars and all of that, we're actually going to go through misinformation wars. And we're currently kind of already in the midst of that, because whoever has the prettier posts and more engaging reels is going to get more followers on social media. So literally wars are fought on social media channels. Just think about, Ukraine, think about Gaza and so on, and what the algorithm kind of pushes down your throat, and how you are supposed to kind of, think about it. What is the mindset? What is the information available to you? And this is where we also then get back to the kind of like the general aspect of just literacy, and what are we being taught about health literacy, environmental and climate literacy, and so on, and how are we able to kind of process that misinformation and decide what information is true and what isn't. And I think there was a really good question about from the audience about the trust in science, because we are currently seeing that it is technically breaking down a little bit, and we're not seeing as much trust in the institutions and in data that we have. And when trust erodes, even the best possible data cannot protect us. So what we need transparency, we need accountability when it comes to science, and we also need it to be translated in a way that is palatable to people so that people understand it. So information needs to be youth-friendly, it needs to be age-friendly, it needs to be disability-friendly, so that everyone is able to reach it and then also process it in the way that, that it needs to be done. And when it comes to trust, it must be earned and not demanded. So that means that it's a continuous path that you need to work on, and it's not just some sort of like pinnacle that you're gonna reach it and now everyone trusts me and everything's gonna be fine. You need to keep on working on things. And I think that's where, again, bringing it back to civil society, because they come from the communities, from the society itself, it inherently has that trust of the communities around them, because every single person knows a family member, a friend that is a part of a civil society movement. And you are much more likely to trust that person and the data and information that they are sharing rather than someone that you only see on TV once or twice a month talking from, you know, government standpoint or UN even standpoint. So we saw how how that trust broke down over the past couple of years, but it also has shown that what are the possibilities and opportunities to kind of tackle that. And that's also where, for example, the WHO Youth Council comes in, so that we are able to make information accessible, that we are able to answer questions that people have about health, well-being, climate, you know, anything that pertains to that. And last but not least, regarding foresight, it's not just about predicting disasters, but you actually have to prevent them. And if you think about it, prevention is much, much cheaper than recovery and also more humane.
Yeah. I am so glad this was the opening panel of the Munich Security Conference side events, because I feel really deeply that what we've done here, the four of you, is to expose a lot of possibility, frankly, for agency. And when David was talking, I remembered, you know, a lot of the people who were laid off at USAID, they went right on organizing for the projects that they were working on in country. So this idea that actually agency goes ahead of oftentimes state development, that social cohesion, and we see this, by the way, where, you know, systems are actively threatened, that people flock to trusted environments, whether it's, you know, the 6 states in New England, the 6 states on the west coast of the United States trying to figure out what actual immunization policy is what they want to move forward with, and applying that and sharing those experiences globally, or sharing the kind of data that will make investments and risk averting and preventing investments possible, such that there is always a sustaining, human thriving aspect to it. I want to close with something that David said, which was this idea that learned helplessness is a choice. And there is fundamental, I think of Hannah Arendt, our German-American state philosophic sort of legend, this idea that there is human purpose in active living, in the viva activa. And I think, Parag, you made it so clear in your presentation. I think everybody here has made it clear that it begins with the individual and individual choices around that, but then that can expand in a lot of different forms. Now is a time, because the questions and the problems are urgent and rife. But I think what we've heard today is one way in which we, or a series of ways and series of perspectives in which we can unlearn helplessness, if that's a choice that we've made. You have ample opportunity after this panel to continue to deepen this conversation. I'm very grateful that we have a reception out there for you. Thank you for coming. And most importantly, thank you for taking up the mantle of agency from some of the suggestions we've heard this evening. So thank you, and thank this wonderful panel.
Thank you. Well done.
All right.
Bravo.
8:03.
Bravo.